Yo, how's it going everybody? It's Sketch and welcome back to the channel. And on today's show we're going to be taking a look at GunForce, a side-scrolling run and gunner from developer Irem, releasing for the arcade in 1991 and getting a Super Nintendo port in 1992 from Bit Studio. I remember playing the ROM of the arcade version way back in the day on MAME, and when I saw the Super Nintendo version at the Portland Retro Expo in 2019, I figured why not pick it up. Compared to the arcade version, the port isn't terrible, but it's quite a ways from being even remotely close to as good as the arcade game. For what's there though, it's actually a pretty entertaining playthrough. Even with the quirks of this port, there's some pretty interesting stuff in there. But before we get too much into that, let's get caught up with the story real quick. The story is actually really simple. You're dropped onto the battle-engulfed fire island and you gotta shoot your way off the island one Wilhelm scream at a time. That's really it. There's no intro cutscene or a text overlay to tell us about what's happening. You just kinda go through the 5 stages and do your best Angus Young impression at the end of each boss encounter. Gameplay wise, it's a 2D run and gun, kind of in the vein of Contra if it were significantly more choppy, and if you played it as if you were playing it underwater at all times, besides your character's really funny moon jump. I mean, it's really funny to look at. The arcade version I remember being a lot better than Super Nintendo port, but when I put together this was the same team that did the Last Action Hero port for Super Nintendo, it makes a lot more sense why this game feels the way it does. Control is pretty clunky, but it does what it needs to do ultimately, but it's got some issues, especially trying to get into and out of vehicles, which there are a lot of. You even get a little mech suit at the end of the game, which is also pretty fun to pilot. You can shoot in 8 directions and lock your fire and also strafe, even though you can kind of blag your way through the game without these, but the option's there if you want to use it. You can also shoot boxes and crates to reveal weapon upgrades to add some extra catch-up to the combat, and boss encounters are also pretty standard for the most part, but at the end our hero always poses in triumph and goes on to the next mission, which will have a small little cutscene showing your next move. Graphics wise, this is kind of a mixed bag. The intro graphic is kind of sick and at first gives the impression, hey, this might actually be pretty tight, but then you start to play it, and aside from the big sprites and the vehicles, the graphics kind of stay on a chord of meh to just aight. The bosses again won't be anything you haven't seen before design wise, and the final boss is basically a Bobo version of the Contra 1 encounter at the end, almost verbatim. And all in all, where there are some decent things tossed in, every so often there's some pretty bland spots too. Sound wise, this game is pretty entertaining. The music is all super laid back and almost like elevator music as you run through these random locations, blowing everything with a pulse to hell. The soundtrack is probably the most out of place composition I've ever heard in an action game, following close second to Dimension Force. The explosions in GunForce, however, actually don't sound that bad, and every time you lose a stock, your character does the Wilhelm scream, which is always good for a quick laugh. Audio in general just kind of falls in the middle overall, considering after a while the music kind of starts to grow on you, even though in context it's pretty goofy, but the accompanying audio effects kind of balance it out some to make it altogether passable. GunForce for the Super Nintendo is nowhere near as good as the arcade version and most certainly doesn't compare to the sequel in a lot of departments, but this one, if you can find it for really cheap and like really silly run and gun games, this one might strike your fancy. The arcade version is definitely the way to go on this one, and the SNES port, while being an interesting case, is not necessarily unplayable, but it's got levels of jank only the brave will probably want to tackle. But for what it lacks in polish, it's got a lot of things to make you laugh at least. GunForce gets a 6 out of 10, and I'd only recommend this to those that really like to play kind of offbeat ports of games, or games that have a good source material but are still kind of rough around the edges with the ports. Or an even better idea, just play Contra, or if you can find the cabinet, play the arcade version of GunForce. If you made it this far in the video, I thank you so much. If you found this video helpful, that's awesome. I'm glad you can use it as a resource. Check back often. We'll have more reviews and commentaries coming up in the near future, but until then, stay safe out there, take it easy. I'll see you on the next one.